Kill the Indian and save the man. If there were any phrase to best summarize the paternalistic, ethnocentric American attitude towards Native American Indians during the late 1800s, this would be it. In the early 1800s, the United States underwent a series of policies with the goal of assimilating Native American Indians into European American society. American Indian children were sent to boarding schools to be civilized, and often came back a whole other person. They were completely reclothed, regroomed, and renamed. American Indians were openly viewed as inferior, uncultured, and entirely uncivilized. They were treated so poorly that it appears as if European Americans were simply racist and power-hungry individuals who wanted to control not only land but dominate human beings as well. As present-day Americans, reflecting back on this time, most of us feel disgraced to say that this was our America, that our presidents and congressmen and local farmers treated Native Americans so inhumanely. When we think humanitarianism, we think of fighting for human rights, making sure children in other countries are fed, providing water and shelter to the needy, and so much more. That said, the very notion of humanitarianism is not set in stone. What it means to be a humanitarian evolves through time and through culture. Everything is culturally specific, and humanitarianism is no exception. With this in mind, I draw from Michael Barnett's explanation of the different forms humanitarianism has taken to present a different perspective on the Americanization movement of the 1800s. I'm in no way saying that the actions and policies that were put in place during this time were good or right. They were not in the slightest. But I do believe it is easier to condemn those actions 200 years later, once American society has altered completely. Using Barnett's notion of imperial humanitarianism, I argue that much of the actions committed by American elites towards innocent Native Americans was perceived by many as a form of humanitarianism, not simply a form of oppression. Humanitarianism as a movement emerged in the mid-18th century, provoked by a rapid societal transformation, in which political, social, and economic forces were breaking down existing dynamics and encouraging individuals to envision new forms of responsibility throughout the public sphere. Humanitarianism did not just emerge. It was a result of historic developments and a changing attitude because of it. Humanitarianism is not intrinsic, and it changes over time. Barnett categorizes three different ages of humanitarianism: imperial humanitarianism, neo-humanitarianism, and liberal humanitarianism, with each different form driven by three forces: destruction, production, and compassion. In the 19th century, colonialism was at its peak. According to Barnett, with the destructive forces of colonialism came the compassion of civilization, or at least that is how civilization was perceived at the time. Using Barnett's framework, I've come to the conviction that both federal Indian policy and the attitude of the typical European American was shaped as much by paternalism, however misguided, as by white greed. Just as with the European missionaries in Africa, many white elites saw American government policy as a civilizing mission. In fact, as one U.S. philanthropist put it in 1886, the Indians were to be safely guided from the night of barbarism into the fair dawn of Christian civilization. In 1878, Captain Richard Henry Pratt was a leader of the Assimilation movement. He had great respect and compassion for the Indians under his charge and wanted desperately to save them by educating them and assimilating them into white society. A devout Christian, Pratt felt it was his sacred duty to save their souls by converting them to his faith. He sent letters among letters among letters to his friend explaining his desperate efforts to convince the president and cabinet that the Indians should be educated and taught to live like whites rather than being exterminated, and his, quote, dream of starting schools to educate Indian children and adults. As mentioned earlier, Indian boarding schools did become prominent in America. Yet when we consider these schools today, we most definitely do not view them as a redemption of souls, despite that being their initial intention. Americans today are just as weary of Native American mascots, condemning the ways European American culture has taken that of the Native American Indian and appropriated it entirely. Liberal humanitarianism is clearly grasping our society here. Barnett associates this humanitarian attitude with the end of the Cold War, the desire for sovereign nations and democracy, and a great emphasis on human rights. Essentially, the values of this humanitarian form presents a stark contrast to that of the imperial humanitarian. Even just looking at satirical comics made today, it is clear that today's America condemns the America of the 1800s. one that, through our modern eyes, was arrogant and cruel. Now we have to consider, as time goes on, are perceptions of what is morally good and humanitarian going to change? Our culture is bound to change, and change takes hold in all forms. It is important to consider the fact that American society at the time of the assimilation movement likely acted with genuine desire to act humanitarian, if not all, at least most. Barnett explains that the global powers in the late 19th century intervened other countries with the intention of liberation, as defined by the civilized. I believe the same applies to America during their assimilation of Native Americans, a sort of domestic colonization. How can we say that there was really that much of a difference between the intrinsic goals of the American assimilation policy at the time and characteristics of development today? Despite being more subtle today, both forms of humanitarianism assert paternalism and culturally superior attitudes in the ways they view global development. This is a disturbing comparison to even make, but sheds an important light on America and humanitarianism. If history is any indicator of the future, I would not be surprised if the ways America pursues humanitarianism today is condemned 100 years from now as humanitarianism takes on yet another form.